for our third paper. The presenter is Marco Becht. The work is Outsourcing Active Ownership in Japan, and the co-authors are Marco Becht, Julian Franks, Hideaki Miyajima, and Kazunori Suzuki. Marco.
Thank you, Luca. So you've already mentioned my co-authors, and the title of the paper is Outsourcing Active Ownership in Japan. It's ongoing work, and here's the outline. So first of all, I'll talk about what we actually mean by outsourcing active ownership. I'll then talk about another dimension to this, which is going to be important, which is quiet versus public engagement, and I think Stefano already gave an example of this. And then we'll talk about the case of Japan, and I'll show you some results. So let's start with the outsourcing active ownership. Why is this something that we actually need to talk about? I think Jeff already gave some motivation for this, and the previous paper also gave motivations on this. People have signed signatories of stewardship codes, PRI, etc., etc. So asset managers are committed to active ownership, but in practice, it's not easy to do. They might not be large. They might not have the resources to actually do this very effectively. Even if you are large and sophisticated and have resources, there's geography. It's true, we are all meeting in a global meeting on Zoom, but can you actually, if you are in California, very effectively engage with a company in Japan? And of course, vice versa. So there are these kind of difficulties that actually speak to you not doing the job yourself, but actually outsourcing the active ownership to somebody else. Now, in the paper, we really talk about two types of outsourcing, which I've here for a lack of imagination called type 1 and type 2 outsourcing. So type 1 you're all familiar with because it's essentially you give the work to another fund, and of course the funds that are doing most of the work in the United States and also around the world are of course hedge fund activists. Now we all know this, April has done research on this, many people have done research on this, we know their playbook. So that's not really new. I think what's new, and this was already mentioned today, and that's really one of the frontiers of engagement, is that now this kind of outsourcing has moved to the ESG space. And I think engine number 1 was mentioned several times. That was really something that's completely new this year. And we are now seeing that this kind of outsourcing to other funds is also moved now into the ESG space. Now, what's the advantage of this? Well, the advantage of this is that you actually don't have to pay because the activists pay for this through, they get a success fee. If they're successful, they get a capital gains. And the Engine 1 campaign was very expensive. Jeff called about teeing it up for them. So that's, they tee it up for you for free. Now, of course, you might say there's a disadvantage, which is that you don't get to influence the agenda. And that's, of course, true. Engine 1 decides what they want to do, but maybe that's actually not quite true because whether they engage or not is endogenous, and sometimes hedge funds and Engine 1s are called into a situation. They're being told, why don't you engage here? If you do, we will support you. So there's that sort of outsourcing going on as well. Now, the second type of outsourcing, which I'll talk about more today and what actually the paper is focusing on, is that you actually contract with a service provider in order to do active ownership for you. And they are specialist providers in the world. For example, and I want to mention all of them, but I'm just mentioning 2 of them. There's, of course, the Hermes Equity Ownership Service and Governance for Owners. And Governance for Owners, Japan, is what the paper is going to be about. So you contract with them, you can set the engagement agenda, you can actually, together with them, decide who gets engaged, and then they will do the active ownership for you. And in the case of our example, if you are a UK investor, Governance for Owner Japan will do this for you in Japan. Now, the second dimension is public versus quiet engagement. So public's pretty obvious. the engagement is disclosed, either mandatory or voluntary. The engagement makes strategic use of the press. It's observable to the market and also to researchers, and the outcomes are observable if there are any outcomes. Whereas quiet activism is not disclosed, it's not observable. The outcomes you can observe, but you can't necessarily link it to the engagement itself. So what's the caveat? Well, some public engagements actually quiet initially and then go public, but that's a difficulty which I'll ignore for now. So you then have this kind of matrix. So you have the outsourcing type to another fund or to an active ownership service, and then the outsourcing that we are familiar with is the one here. So public, so that's hedge fund activism, and the one I'll show you is Go Japan. So that's the equity ownership service that really has a preference for engaging in private. Now, we're also fortunate to have data from another fund that actually is a bit like a hedge fund, but it does everything in private. And I'm sorry to say, we haven't finished that research. I was hoping to present this today from Japan, but because of COVID, you can't see it. I'm actually in Brussels. So that's for the next seminar, hopefully. Right, so outsourcing type 2, so Go Japan's quiet engagements, what do they look like? Well, they have engaged about 39 firms between 2009 2018. It's all closed doors, so nothing is disclosed to the public at all. It's not a fund, but it's actually a consortium. So it's several asset managers that have hired them, and they engage, if you like, collectively for them. And in this period, in these 39 firms, they put 156 items on their engagement agenda, and it's the typical kind of things, so board structure and so forth. Now note, it's not just ESG in the CSR sense, but they also go after payout, cash, strategy, and abolition of takeover defenses. What they don't do is they don't put the company in play, so they're not asking for takeovers. What are the outcomes? So how successful are they in achieving their objectives? Well, we have two benchmarks. One is actual outcomes that we can verify, observe in the press, so through press releases. So there the overall rate is about 51%. Now that might seem low, but remember, this is what we can actually observe in the press, and some of these outcomes might not come out in press releases. They themselves also assess this, and they self-assess 70%. I don't think, well, we don't know, but I don't think they are lying here. So I think we can rely on this 70%, except that the difference is we don't get them through press releases. So the success rate is much higher than for public activism, as I'll show you in a second. But the demands don't include takeovers and going private. So what does it look like then for public activism? Well, the Japanese story is, I think, quite well known. So public activism, hedge fund activism is a thing in Japan because companies are widely held. So this goes from 2000 to 2019, 135 engagements that have put various items on the agenda. And the concentration is, of course, on board payout strategy, M&A, and all the other things that hedge fund activists usually ask for. Now, what's the success rate? It's actually very low, 33%. But when they're successful, they are successful in payouts and M&A. And what's the return on this? Well, you get the well-known initial pop when the stake is disclosed. And then, of course, when the takeover takes place, you get the outcome on top of it. So depending on the window that you use, you get a total return of 12, 15, 22%. So ex ante, not very successful. Ex post, when it's successful, very profitable. What does it look like for Go Japan? Well, you don't have the pop because we don't observe when the clients of the equity ownership service invested in the first place, and since it's not disclosed to the market, there is no initial pop from the disclosure. But we can observe what happens when the outcomes, so these outcomes that I told you about, the 51% in press releases are disclosed, and you do get, depending on the window that you have, about 5%. Now that seems lower, but that's also, remember, related to the fact that they don't put companies in play, so this does not include M&A. So why then is Go Japan so successful in what they do? Well, there we can only speculate. You can speculate yourselves. It might be that there's generally, if you talk to people in a quiet way, that they might listen more. It could be that it has to do with the objectives. If you say, well, why don't you put your company in play, sell yourself and get eaten up by some raider and then get fired, that might go down less well than saying, actually do something sensible. That's good for the company for your stakeholders. So what's the conclusion? Well, I think we show in the present draft already that this kind of outsourcing of type 2, so outsourcing to an equity ownership service or an active ownership service in combination with quiet, is quite successful in the case of Japan, and that there are some returns associated with it. It's not as profitable as type 1 kind of outsourcing to hedge fund activists, but that largely has to do with the objectives that they go after. And of course, they are ex ante, they're ex post not very successful, or not as successful as ex ante the market expects. Now, what's going to be maybe more interesting is to compare the actual quiet strategy when we get the other comparative element in place, namely this fund that actually targets companies in the way that an activist fund does, but then has this deliberate strategy of not going public, but staying quiet. And I'll not reveal to you today what the preliminary results are. And with this, Luca, I close, and Iko Suzuki is here as well. So if you have any difficult questions, he's going to answer them all. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco, for the excellent presentation. We have two difficult questions already. First is from Jeff.
So what is the size of these firms for which your agent intermediated engagement occurs? Are they large firms or small firms? That is to say, I mean, it seems to me relevant. I mean, if the consortium can influence major firms in Japan, that seems to me important in an economic sense. If basically the targets of their concerted activity are smaller firms, then it's less important, right? Because the low-hanging fruit on a very tiny tree is not the volume of it. I'll stop the metaphor, but you see the point, right? I mean, the reason I ask is because I've been talking to a very active fund in the Toshiba case, right? Made a lot of noise, obviously, but the impact of that firm's activity on that firm, and indeed in many other related firms, is quite significant. And that was not quiet at all. So if we're thinking about the economic importance of different kinds of activism, it seems to me some way to size it ought to be part of the results that you present.
Yeah, so there's a table in the paper that gives you the size in terms of the market cap of the companies that are engaged. I think I take your point, Jeff, but I think it's slightly unfair. I think we document the mechanism, and whom they engage with really depends on whom the clients are invested in. I think the more interesting fact, which I didn't report, is that the stakes are actually relatively small. So the consortium holds relatively small stakes, and it's not that they can threaten a proxy fight. So despite the fact that they're actually quite small stakes, they're actually quite successful.
Marco, as I understand it, Go Japan will act on behalf of several investors when it proceeds with these engagements. Jennifer Hill and I have looked at similar intermediaries, and we've noted that some commentators make this argument that these intermediaries generally will only be able to pursue general or thematic issues, for example, board diversity. And the argument goes that, those sorts of issues are easy for the intermediary to reach a consensus position that's acceptable to their various clients that they can then act on. I was interested to see, though, that the subject matter of Go Japan's engagements relate to matters of company strategy and so on, more company-specific matters. Why do you think that they are able to engage at that more granular level then, and not sort of be confined to those sort of broad thematic issues that these other commentators say that they would expect them normally to be confined to?
I'll first give you my understanding of it, and then I'll turn it to Iko to verify, because he actually spoke to them in Japanese, whereas I don't. My understanding is that it's got to do with the degree of delegation that the asset owners give to the people they outsource to. So how much do you trust the agent? It's my understanding then in the case of Go Japan, they actually delegate quite a lot. So they will not dictate to them. It's Go Japan who come back and say, these are the kind of things that we want to engage on, and it's actually they who formulate the agenda. So they have a pretty broad mandate. So they're actually, it's not that it's very specific. It's more a relational contract than a very specific contract. But and maybe it has to do with the fact that they really think that because these are all people who are very knowledgeable about Japanese companies on the market. And they might, it might be an acknowledgement that they actually know much more about this than the asset, owners who sit really quite far from Japan. Iko, was that a correct summary?
Yeah, I guess so. The way they choose the engagement agenda is pretty much, they try to be independent in that sense. Not to be controlled by although they consult with the asset owners, they generally decide, they have their own independent board to discuss whether these are the appropriate agenda or not. Looking at the list, I agree with Tim that there are a couple of issues which they commonly address, but that's only a fraction of what it is. And most of them, they come up with after thorough analysis of the company itself. So they spend a lot of time analyzing the company, and the first contact that they make is to make a huge presentation with the couple of agenda from outsiders that they think are necessary to be addressed.
Thank you, Iko. I have a question about what is the threat, that implicit threat that the Go Japan can make to be so successful? Or is it a carrot? So what again are the tools that make it
poison in green tea? That's a joke. I really don't know. I defer that one to Iko.
No, that's the people at the Go Japan have this question as well. So they don't really know why they are so successful. I think one of the thing is the coincidence. Japan has adopted, similar to UK, the corporate governance code around 2014. It coincided with the period when it's the first time that the Japanese companies are facing seriously with shareholders. As you know, the Japanese system is more like cross shareholdings, insiders, and no real threat for the board. So I think the Go Japan at that time worked as a catalyst to understand how you should cope with this change in the government policy. So that's why they were so easy to have an access. And they, as Marco was mentioning, most of the companies that, you know, kind of blue chips in Japan. So I was a bit surprised that they're listening.
Another argument that this particular kind of service provider puts forward is that they act like management consultants, except you don't have to pay for them. So, you know, I'm just repeating that argument. I'm not necessarily saying I'm endorsing it.